Have you ever wondered what the differences are between yourself and some of the best drivers on F1 22? Well, I certainly have, and I'm confident enough to call myself a top 1% driver on the F1 22 game.
Are you sure about that?
But I've always wanted to know what the actual difference between myself and an esports driver was, especially since there are a lot of people that seem to think that I could be an F1 esports.
I'm out, man. That nigga's tripping.
So not only is this video going to prove to some of you guys why it's pretty much impossible for me to be an F1 esports just because of the sheer gap between us, it's also going to show you what the small differences are between two laps that can make up the biggest difference. So make sure to stick around until the end so that you can find out what are the 3 definitive differences between myself and F1 esports driver Thomas Ronhaar. So here we are on RacingNet, guys, and what I'm going to be doing is I'm going to be taking a look at a few different tracks and seeing what the primary differences are between myself and Thomas Ronhaar. So taking a look at the first one, which is Great Britain, chose this track mainly because this is a weaker track for me, and I've also done a current lap literally earlier on today just so I can do this video. So taking a look here, you can see I'm currently 91st in the world right now, and we're roughly about 0.4 of a second off of Thomas Ronhaar. Right, so here's the analysis tool, and just to catch you guys up to speed real quick, if you've never used RacingNet, we have speed, we have the brake, we have the throttle, and we have the steering inputs all here to see so that we can actually check out what the differences are. So if you take a look at the steering first, mainly because, you know, that is the most boring one out of the 4 in my opinion. Yeah, it's very smooth all throughout the lap. You can see that there's differences. You can tell when Ronhaar starts to get ahead of myself throughout the lap, but you can see that roughly our steering inputs are very much the same, very smooth, and that allows us to carry a lot more speed into the corners than most people. But the main parts where you can see the differences between my style of driving and Ronhaar's is in the brakes and the throttle. One thing you'll notice is going up to the first braking zone at Silverstone, which is actually turn 3 for Silverstone. You can see I think I was on the brakes just a fraction of a second earlier than he was, but as you can see going into that corner, he holds on to the brakes just a little bit more, around about the 50% mark than I do, carrying a little bit less speed around that corner. However, he's able to get the rotation in and carry more speed on the exit of that corner. Though if you guys know Silverstone, turn 3 isn't necessarily a corner that's very important for the exit. It's mainly turn 5, I believe, or turn 4, one of the corner numbers. That's the most important corner when it comes to exiting in the first sector. So if we take a look at that corner right now, you can see that coming out of the exit there, I roughly get on the brakes just a fraction of a second earlier than he does. However, he's a lot more aggressive on the throttle initially than I am, and that's actually, in my opinion, where the first difference lies between myself and Thomas Ronhaar. Ronhaar is just so much more aggressive in the initial stages of his throttle control, and that's why he's able to get a lot more speed on the exit than I am. And when you make up speed on the exit, it carries all the way down to the next corner. So if you can imagine turn 1 at Spa, you make a great exit, that carries all the way down to the back straight till that next chicane. And another place you can see is roughly here in sector 2 as well. You can see just how much more aggressive he is initially. The first time I actually do get on the throttle earlier than him, but I'm just not aggressive, meaning that by the time we get to 100% on the throttle, he gets there before I do. But in the second part of this corner, you can see right here, not only was I later on the throttle, I was also less aggressive. You can see right around here, but you can see just a little bit of a jagged line there. I'm assuming that he was just teetering on the limit of what the tires were giving him at that point, whereas me throughout that same section, a lot more smoother. So if there was anything I would say in order to be able to gain time for myself around Silverstone, is to be more aggressive initially on the throttle and to just take more risks. You can see on the braking throughout the lap, there's certain areas where there's small differences that lie through this corner. I'm not actually sure what corner that is. It looks like it's Chapel, coming out of Maggots, Beckett's and Chapel. I press on the brakes a little bit harsher than he does, but it seems that because I'm carrying a lot less speed in the corner and sorry, I had to stop myself there because I needed to check one more time. This was indeed through Beckett's and Chapel. So as you can see, looking at the telemetry data, I was a lot harsher on the brakes going through Beckett's, and even though I wasn't carrying as much speed, that allowed me to put my car in a better position. And as you can see from the brake trace here, Ronhaar needed to do a bit of braking through Chapel, whereas I didn't. So yeah, pretty much all the way up until Stowe, I would be gaining small amount of times on Thomas Ronhaar here. Not a lot, of course, but as you can see from that actual replay thing here, you'll see that I just get a little bit closer to him than we were in Chapel here. And you can see we're just gaining just a slight bit amount of time here, me being the blue car, of course, and Ronhaar being the yellow car. And that's just because he broke going into Chapel, whereas I didn't. Right, so this is a much bigger gap of a lap. This is around Spain. We've both not done laps in well over a month. Well, me nearly 2 months, him over a month since we last did our laps. So you can see that I'm roughly about 0.6 of a second. I probably could get a better lap than this, but we'll take a look at this anyway because I feel that this would be pretty interesting to look at. So going through the first braking zone, which is turn 1, you can see I wasn't on the throttle as aggressively as he was, but I did hold it for a little bit longer, probably because I wasn't as aggressive initially on the brakes, allowing me to take a little bit less speed, get the car in a better position to get a better exit. And you do end up seeing that right here. I do actually end up going to 100% before he does, but I have to lift off a little bit, which allows him to catch up. So overall, I feel like I was a little bit better maybe through this corner, just fractionally. But yeah, you can see just moving on that he just gets better and better as the lap goes on. Right here, for example, this is a pretty big difference. The way he comes off the brakes throughout this corner versus me, I hold it at around about 50-60% for a little bit and then bleed off, whereas he just essentially, he's not super quick with it, but he comes up a lot more aggressive than I do. If you take a look at the chicane as well, I sort of do a little bit of pump braking there. So I lifted off the brakes a little bit and then came back on the brakes a little bit and then did it again. Whereas he was pretty smooth with how he broke and then lifted off the brakes there. So before we get into the next track, here's 2 things I need to tell you guys. The first one is the second difference that I believe between myself and Ronhaar, and that's the way we come off of the brakes. Most of the time, he's a lot more smooth when he needs to be. He just understands how to get onto the brakes more and how to bleed off a lot better than I do. There's some corners where maybe I'm just using a bit too much brake when I should be just bleeding off entirely, and there's other corners where I'm actually bleeding off the brakes way too quickly instead of holding onto it a little bit more. He just has a better understanding of how to use his brakes. And for the second thing, make sure to smash the like button on this video if you are enjoying it. It will help the video get pushed out to more people like yourselves, so go ahead, smash that like button. Next up, we have Brazil, and once again, we're roughly about 4/10 slower than Ronhaar on this lap. So let's take a look at it. And this is, again, what I was talking about here. This doesn't really make sense to me. Why would I be lifting off in a flat out corner? I don't remember lifting off at this part here. So I don't know if that is a bug within RaceNet or if it's a bug within my pedals. Something I'm definitely going to need to find out though. But once again, you can see the main differences here are in fact the on throttle application, the initial part of it, where he's just a bit more aggressive and can carry a lot more speed on exits because of it compared to me. And then the brakes as well, he just has a better understanding. This corner here is a very good indicator of that. You can see he just bleeds off the brakes as he should, whereas me, I lacked that confidence and I needed to have an extra dab on the brakes just to make sure that the car was going to rotate. That could also be a setup thing though, so you do want to be careful with that. You don't want to just take everything at face value. This could definitely just be a setup thing. Maybe my car understeered through that corner, so I needed a little bit extra dab on the brakes, whereas he had a really good car that rotated around each corner and he could just bleed off. So I'm currently editing the video right now and I just realized something. I've only told you guys 2 of the definitive differences between myself and an esports driver. And the third one is very simple, but a lot of people tend to just scoff off, and that is simply the amount of time that an esports driver would practice on the game versus how much I play the game. For example, when it comes to esports week, you know, when the drivers are actually racing in the official races, they can spend upwards of 100+ hours on the game in just that week. Whereas in the past week, I have literally only played F1 22 once. And trust me guys, that can make a huge difference. Simply playing the game a couple of more hours a week, especially if you're at the lower end of the spectrum in terms of skill level, can really help you improve at the game. However, when you get to the higher end of the game, it takes a lot more practice to see smaller results. And since I simply don't play the game long enough or enough to warrant that growth, that's the third and probably biggest definitive reason as to why I'm not as good at the game as the F1 Esports drivers. One thing to take a notice though is the steering. If you see that there's a little bit of like jagged lines throughout the lap, it means that they were probably making corrections, or they were making a lot of corrections throughout the lap. You can see that we're both very smooth. There are times where you'll see some very jaggy lines from Ronhaar. I do believe that's just because he's driving on the limit, so he has to make a lot of very small corrections as he goes through the corner. But that's pretty much how you want to drive. You want to be as smooth as possible whilst also being as close to the limit as you can. So yeah, I feel like in terms of driving style, I was pretty good with my steering inputs. It was very smooth, probably in some cases a little bit too smooth. It could mean that I'm not necessarily driving on the limit properly, but yeah, I feel like I was smooth enough with my inputs, which is good. It means I'm not scrubbing off any drastic amount of speeds throughout fast speed corners, but I could probably improve my braking and my throttle application a little bit as well. Using RaceNet, those are probably the two definitive differences that I can see between a top 1% driver and a top 0.01% driver. Make sure to let me know in the comment section if you saw any differences between myself and Ronhaar that I didn't mention in this video, and make sure to click the video right here. This is recommended by YouTube. YouTube are pretty good at knowing what you're going to want to watch next, so make sure to click it and enjoy.